Hello and welcome to the Power Hour podcast. If you're new to the show, it is I, Scott Barrett, joined as always by John Proctor. How are you doing, John?
Good, man. How's it going?
Good. If you're new, basically we record very sporadically and typically just drink heavily and ramble on about whatever comes to mind regarding fantasy football. However, this is a very special episode as it marks our first ever podcast recorded for iTunes. This will also be the first installment of a series we're trying out for MFL10s. Basically, each week we'll have a different guest on to talk about a specific position and their rankings and strategy for that position in MFL10s. Spoiler alert, next week's guest will be Graham Barfield on to talk running backs. This week's guest is a fan of the podcast, or at least I believe he's watched it at least once. He's a personal friend of mine and a QB and Superflex League expert. He writes for 2QBs, 4for4, and RotoViz. He's legit the guy I go to when I want to talk quarterbacks. And just like Johnny, he's an accomplished lawyer in his personal time. John, please help me welcome Josh Lake.
Thanks for having me, guys. This is fun. I don't do the video thing often. It's exciting.
We're trying to corner that market.
All right, so I'd be a little remiss if I didn't get into the sponsors. Got to pay the bills. Today's podcast is unofficially sponsored by Halliburton, Old Granddad Whiskey, and a small online secretarial college named Saginaw Valley State University. All right. Josh, you've done some great work this season focusing on quarterbacks in MFL10s. Your first article on the subject for RotoViz was particularly a favorite of mine. In it, you talked about your specific strategy targeting quarterbacks in MFL10s. Do you want to talk a little bit about that, Josh?
Sure. I wanted to see if there was any connection between the quarterbacks we drafted last year and success. Because one of the common narratives that I didn't really buy is just wait till late and it doesn't matter who you get. You just throw two or three together and you'll get starting caliber. It'll be fine. And so I started with that narrative as my hypothesis and found there's next to no correlation just last year. So this is only looking at 2015, but there was next to no correlation between the draft round of your quarterback and your team's success. And so defining your team's success as in the average finish for teams rostering that player. So across all of MFL, I think it was over 2,000 leagues, where did the teams having those players finish? And so there's almost no connection between how long you waited and how well you did. But what did have a very strong correlation was how many top 12 weeks your quarterbacks had and your team's success, which at first blush seems kind of simple. Like, you score points with your quarterback, you do well, but that's still completely ignoring the entire rest of your roster. This was completely agnostic as to how well you drafted running backs and wide receivers. You still were winning more by significant margins if your quarterbacks were hitting the top 12. And so I found that pretty interesting.
Yeah, so you're saying average draft position didn't really matter too much. Do you think that's just because ADP was terrible last year? You had guys like Bortles and Dalton going late. Even Cam was like a ninth-round pick. Luck got hurt. Rodgers didn't have Jordy. Do you think that was the case? It was just a bad ADP year, or do you think just in general it's kind of typically like that where ADP doesn't always align closely with QB1 weeks?
I'm hesitant to make too broad a declaration given only 1 year's data. I don't have older years. But it strikes me that if you have late-round quarterbacks doing better and the narrative is waiting on quarterback is already better. I mean, 2015 was just historically good for late-round quarterbacks. Like you said, we had so many come out of the woodwork to become starters. You would think that all of that would combine to mean this was an even better year, that you should have more success the longer you waited on quarterback, rather than the opposite. I mean, the argument has been that that's the better approach, is wait. And even in a good year for waiting, it didn't seem to pay out in terms of just correlation.
Okay, so who were some of the quarterbacks with top QB1 weeks last year in MFL10s.
So just last year, the big names that you would expect were Brady, Cam Newton, Aaron Rodgers. They all did well. Even in an off year, Aaron Rodgers still did really well. Half of his weeks he was a QB1. But then the names that came out of nowhere, Bortles, Andy Dalton came out of nowhere for the second time in his career. Kirk Cousins was another one. Ryan Fitzpatrick, Tyrod Taylor. I mean, the list was really long last year of guys that you really most of us didn't expect going into the year, and then they were consistently QB1s.
Yeah, this was a great year for late-round QB. It seemed like it wasn't even just that the opportunity cost of drafting a QB early, but it was just like all of the late-round guys just exploded, while a lot of the early-round guys just didn't do well at all.
Well, not all of them did. I mean, Nick Foles was pretty terrible. And shout out to 14-team mocker. And I mean, it was kind of like hit or miss. I think in the late rounds, as much as the late round quarterbacks were sort of the better option, you were really. I mean, there were a lot of guys who were really popular. I mean, like Cutler and Alex Smith was one that people would just take at the very bottom of their drafts. I know Bradford was popular, and I mean he was okay, but there were some really popular late round options that were, I mean, absolute garbage when it came to looking at Josh's list of top 12 finishes.
Right. By no means was it you wait and you'll find someone. It was just, at least in the last 6 years, what I've looked at, it was just unprecedented how poorly we did as a community. Our ADP was just so far from the final finishes. Which
go on.
Which is something to say for diversifying a little bit, just because we're not. I mean, a lot of the people in the community are really smart, but in the NFL, there's just so much variance that, especially in something like MFL10s, where if you're dead set on a guy and you have him on 60-70% of your rosters, and then Jordy Nelson goes down in training camp or whatever, then that's kind of what you're going to be stuck with.
We should also probably talk about the kind of atypical scoring system that MFL10 offers. I feel like in standard it's typically like 1 point for every 25 passing yards, and maybe like -1 for every turnover. In MFL10s, it's like typical 4 points per passing touchdown, 6 points per rushing touchdown, 1 point per 10 rushing yards. But it's also 1 point per 20 passing yards and -2 points for every turnover. So that kind of like waters down the rushing quarterbacks a tad. Like I know in standard scoring, Cam Newton was a QB1 in 75% of his weeks last year, but in MFL10s, he was only a QB1 in 62% of his games. When I originally gave you my ranks the other week, Josh, that was kind of based on standard scoring. If I had to adjust it for MFL10s, I might drop Russell Wilson, maybe even Cam a tad, just for some of the pure passers like Aaron Rodgers or Luck or Breeze. How do you adjust to this scoring system in MFL10s, Johnny and Josh, if at all?
I mean, I think it boosts the passers a little bit versus the rushers, because it's 5 yards less than a standard scoring to get a point for passing. So I think that's the first thing we notice. And fumbles being -2 can kind of hurt your rushing guys a little bit more too, because they seem to be a little more fumble prone when they're moving around in the pocket.
So not too many Mark Sanchez shares this year?
I don't know that I have any at this point. I would have to look.
Yeah, that's a no.
All right, Josh, do you want to move into our rankings? Johnny posted his a couple days ago. You and I kind of went back and forth and posted ours last week. Just digging into it a little bit, Josh, with you, I noticed our ranks were actually like very similar.
Yeah, they really are.
I'm looking at it right now. I'm 7 spots higher on Tyrod, Again, maybe in MFL10s, I dropped that. I was 5 spots higher on Osweiler. I know you're not a fan of that. I don't think he's a great talent, but he had the most pace of play last year. He just drafted 2 wide receivers in the top 3 rounds. And then I'm also 3 spots higher on Blake Bortles and Fitzpatrick. Do you guys want to talk about any of those?
The Tyrod one I'll jump in on. I mean, I have thoughts on the rest of them too, but Tyrod, I'm torn on Tyrod because I love the guy and think he was such a huge steal last year, and he still is this year. I mean, I could look at it. Let's see where he's at right now. Just in May, he's QB 20 in MFL10s, and so he's still probably a value. The rushing, like you said, just the scoring system hurts him, but I think also one concern that I have is the injury risk, and that concerns me in an NFL where I only want to have 2 quarterbacks, because I'm taking a guy that already is going to be hit and miss because he's low volume, he's not a high volume offense, he can have weeks where he gets shut out, and then if on top of that he's going to miss weeks to injury, I worry just how reliable he's going to be for QB1 weeks. And so I think he has plenty of upside, like points per game, QB 11, 12, I don't have a problem with that. But I don't know that I would draft him there just given the risks that he has.
I think that's a very good point on Tyrod's injury risk. He's not like Cam Newton, who's 245 pounds. He's 215 pounds. That's a valid point. Maybe I didn't really consider. My thinking with him was just that last year he was tied for 3rd most in fantasy points per dropback. That's insane efficiency. I think he's like secretly like low key, just a really talented quarterback that no one, especially the Bills, want to admit for some reason. He was PFF's number 13 graded passer, and then he was one of only 13 quarterbacks ever to have 3,000 passing yards and 500 rushing yards in a season, and he didn't even play a full year. I think he's a great talent, but again, that's a good point on the injury risk. I didn't really consider.
And there's something to be said for a quarterback who gets as many years behind a decent NFL quarterback as he got, and then he gets thrown out into the field, and there's really not a whole lot of tape to defend against him. So there's also the possibility that defenses are going to be able to scheme a little more against him this year than they were last year. Not to say that that's going to make a big difference. I agree with you, Scott, that I think he's a pretty good quarterback. But I think that still hurts a little bit. And then you add Watkins' injury history and his current injury, and I think a lot of his points per dropback had to do with being able to throw these bombs to Watkins and knowing he was going to be open. So if he's not out there on the field, that's not going to be happening.
It also had to do with them being very run-heavy, which is always a concern you have with the Rex Ryan offense. But before we go back into player eval and get to the next player, maybe we should talk about how many quarterbacks each of us are rostering, and why, if you're only rostering 2, it's important to maybe diversify or be cautious of injury risk or maybe Brady suspension, something like that. Josh, how many quarterbacks are you drafting on average for each MFL 10?
Very heavily favoring 2 over 3. But I'll take a third depending on, like you said, if I have someone that I'm more concerned about in those 2. Also, if certain quarterbacks fall to me in the late rounds, there's guys I like there. Like I think Johnny is pretty high on Fitzpatrick, or has a lot of ownership, and he's a guy that if he falls to me, I'll probably add him even if I don't necessarily need him, but maybe over a flyer, eighth wide receiver or something like that. But the vast majority I've got 2.
Yeah, I think Fitzpatrick is a guy you can take as a third quarterback because there's still that uncertainty of, I mean, when. I think it's more of when is he going to be playing more so than is he going to be playing. I mean, there's a chance that he doesn't sign with the Jets until week 4 or 5 when their quarterback play is just abysmal and they need him. So you can't really. It's hard to take him as only your second quarterback when there's still that inherent risk, but the upside that he has and essentially being free is kind of worth grabbing as a third quarterback if you think that your team is stable enough to support a third one.
I'll note if I can, the other concern I would have if he's your second quarterback is that he's the 28th quarterback off the board. Like, you have really hamstrung yourself if you're waiting, figuring you're going to take him, and then he goes off your board, and you're just left with nothing to choose from.
That's true.
Very true.
I gotta say, quarterback is the position I diversify most with MFL10s. And again, I ranked like top 10 in the leaderboard last year. I did at least 125 MFL10s last year. I was profitable, whatever. But I was murdered by for some reason I paired luck with Flacco like at least like a dozen times. Like every time I took luck, I grabbed Flacco, and that just like murdered all of those teams that were decent. Had Baldwin. It just killed me. So like quarterback is the one I diversify most, just because I always go or mostly go with only 2 QBs. Are you diversifying a lot, or are you just no? I'm gonna grab my guys. Injuries be damned.
I don't diversify a whole lot. I do try and avoid high market shares of the guys I'm worried about, but I really am not concerned. I'm not at the volume you are. I think I'm going into 33 right now. I'll probably end up in the 50 to 60 range at the end, which is still high volume. But as long as I stay under about 33% ownership, then I'm fine. Which 33 to 40, like that probably, I guess you guys can tell me. I think that's high for some owners, but for Rivers and Dalton, those are the 2 I'm really loading up on, and I'm fine if I own them in a third of my leagues. Below the guys that I feel really good at their price, those I'm diversifying. But those 2 names I have no problem taking a lot of.
Yeah, so that brings us back to your rankings. Again, we agreed on a lot of guys, but you were 6 spots higher on Dalton. This was pre-Tyler Eifert's injury, and this is like really curious to me because Dalton is like one of my top 3 most owned quarterbacks. Again, pre-Eifert injury, and you're also 3 spots higher on Jameis. Do you want to talk about Dalton and Jameis and why you're so high on them, or at least maybe why I'm so low on them?
I'm not a huge Jameis guy. I mean, I have him at QB 16, but I think that what we saw was a pretty remarkable rookie season that was buoyed by a lot of rushing touchdowns, but just a really reliable floor. And so I like Jameis on the teams, particularly where I've gone early-ish quarterback, like a Breeze, or if I end up with Brady, someone that I think is going to have a lot of good weeks. Then I'm targeting someone that more has a safe floor, even if he's not quite as explosive, but someone that I think can get me a consistent 15, 18 points probably most weeks. So I like Jameis in a role. I don't know that he has the upside that some people expect him to have.
I'm with you. And with Jameis, I think he's a guy who I'm pretty much never getting because of he's kind of like the quarterback when someone times out, they get him. And that's kind of why his ADP is messed up, because he's like one of the top dyno quarterbacks. So he sort of sits at the top of the QB rankings list on the MFL ADP, so he usually ends up going like the 9th round, which is like no chance I'm taking him at that point.
It's a good point. How the dynasty rankings kind of screw up the ADP, or at least the drop-down list on MFL10s. Yeah, I agree with you. And I mean, I'm not too high on him, but again, ASJ was out for a majority of the season. I love ASJ. If you've read any of my tight end articles, Vincent Jackson was hurt. Kenny Bell was hurt. Mike Evans missed a few games at the beginning of the season and played horrifically. Hopefully he'll improve. There's a lot that could definitely go right for Jameis this year, and QB 16 isn't too crazy. There's just a few guys I might like above him. How many spots are you dropping down Dalton with the news of the Eifert injury, or are you just keeping him where you have him?
I have Eli right after him, and I'll be switching that. Given the Eifert injury, I do think I'll take Eli over him, but that may be about it unless we hear worse news about Eifert. To me, right now, the latest I've heard is it's unclear. Maybe he misses a week, maybe he misses 3 weeks, maybe he misses none. It's not enough that I'm saying I'm going to drop him several spots right now, but I'm open to that possibility if we start finding out that Eifert's timetable is going into the year.
Yeah, and I think and as Evan Silva was kind of talking on the podcast with Sigmund Bloom on his Fantasy Feast the other day. I think the fear is not necessarily that without Eifert, Dalton is suddenly going to be like a bad quarterback, and he's not going to be able to, hit AJ Green and the sort of scrubs that are after him, because I think Dalton has always shown that he's a better quarterback than people think. I think the fear is that they go sort of into that run-heavy mode that they did the year before last, where they just switch to that power offense and Dalton loses volume if Eifert is not playing. But that aside, I still think he's one of those guys who can put up some huge games because AJ Green is still that guy. So there's not a whole lot of risk with Dalton. You just may lose a little bit of that upside if they switch the offense around while Eifert's missing.
Yeah, so there's concern with Eifert, but then, and I'm like I'm a big like kind of Sanu doubter. I don't think he's very good, but I still think there's a significant drop off in talent from Marv Jones to LaFell, even though I have a ton of LaFell shares in MFL10s right now, and from Sanu to Boyd, who I really don't like. So that has me a little worried for Dalton, but then I'm completely torn on Hugh Jackson leaving Cincinnati, because either that's like a terrible thing because Dalton was great with Hugh Jackson, he has a new offensive coordinator, or that's actually like awesome for Dalton because Hugh Jackson ranked fifth in attempts in 2014 and 7th in rushing attempts in 2015. So he's a historically very run-heavy offensive coordinator. So maybe this even frees up Dalton to kind of just let loose. I'm not really sure.
The thing is, though, is that while he was their offensive coordinator before, or when in 2014, that was Dalton's worst year. So under Hugh Jackson, Dalton has only had one good statistical fantasy year, and the rest of those seasons, I mean, Hugh Jackson was on staff, but he wasn't the offensive coordinator at that time. So if you look at his kind of whole career, he was better before Hugh Jackson until this recent explosion in 2015. But that wasn't necessarily his only explosion, because, I mean, he was putting up those numbers prior to 2015 as well.
Yeah, 2013 was a pretty strong year as well.
Yeah.
I agree with that. I would put more stock in the loss of the weapons than I would the change in the coordinator for almost exactly the same reasons Johnny said. I mean, you could very well be right. I just think the fact that we have one really good and one really not good year doesn't make me say I can clearly see a downgrade.
Yeah, I think you guys are right. I mean, I think those are some really good points. All right, Josh, you want to talk about your top four? Because we have the same guys for our top four, but just in a different order. You go Rodgers, Luck, Cam, Russell, which I feel like is maybe a better, more aligned to NFL 10's scoring system, maybe. I'm not sure. I go Cam, Russell, Rodgers, Luck.
Yeah, it definitely gave me some pause seeing that I think both of you guys have Cam at 1, and I'm just not there. I do think that, like you alluded to me, the top four are just so clear. I don't know how anyone can disagree that they're a tier unto themselves. I don't think anyone at 5 is coming close to that tier, and I think ADP bears that out last time I checked. But to me...
Other than Big Ben, I think you're right.
So I'll disagree with both of you. I think the number 5 is super close to the top 4, and I don't think it's Big Ben. Drew Brees has led the league in passing yards 4 out of the past 5 years, and the last time he finished outside of the top 5 QBs on a points per game basis was 2010, when he finished 6th.
I mean,
what do you guys think about Brees?
I'm big on Brees too. As for ADP wise, the community's not. So I think Brees is somebody that I'm taking a good harder look at lately, because I think I kind of just had forgotten about him. I think a lot of people have, because he kind of drops 2 or 3 rounds after Big Ben in MFLs, and I think I'll probably end up with more Brees as the MFL season goes on. But I think there's always the concern with Breeze, just that, and the same with Brady, the same with Palmer, the same, with Peyton last year, is that they're old. So it's always there.
Yeah, I mean, the age cliff is a very real thing, and it's a very unpredictable thing. So there's no way that someone can tell you this is the year Breeze is just going to be done. But that's how it works, and we're not just speculating. We've seen that with plenty of quarterbacks, that you don't see it coming and then they just fall off. Now, there's some exceptions. There are some guys that have a gradual decline, but we see a sharp cliff at some point. And so you have to factor that risk in. I don't see anything that makes me think Breeze is there, but I also think it's very possible that it happens to him or Brady without us expecting it preseason. But I'm with you that Breeze is a clear 5. I think that the price, the uncertainty about what they're doing with all their offensive weapons, and the fear of the age cliff, they're not significant. He's clearly 5, but he's not in that top tier for me.
And see, that's for me why I have Palmer above Breeze. I kind of have them interchangeably, but I prefer the situation for Palmer. And I think one thing that people kind of gloss over with Palmer last year is that he was on an absolute tear before he jacked up his thumb. I think it was his thumb. And after that, he pretty much fell off. So if we get a full season of healthy Palmer, I think if we had a full season of healthy Palmer, I think he would be in that same discussion. But people kind of forget that he was hurt for like a third of the season. But before that, he was kind of like the quarterback to own until that injury. So I think the situation hasn't changed. So I'm kind of in on Palmer a little more than I am on Breeze.
Yeah, you kind of see that tier, the next tier after the top 4. At least 3 of the 4 guys, like Palmer's 36, Breeze is 37, Brady is 38, and they're kind of all there in some sort of order. I like Palmer a lot too. One of the things I like specifically about him is that his best running back, David Johnson, is way better in the passing game. Kind of like how you saw with Fitzpatrick last year, how he averaged like 25 points per game with Bilal Powell, and the team went 8-2 with him when he played, versus Fitzpatrick having the Jets having a losing record and Fitzpatrick scoring only 19 points per game with Powell. Is like something about having an elite receiving option as your main running back kind of improves your points per game as a passer. Maybe it's more passing touchdowns or more passing yards, less handoffs. It just makes you a more attractive option. I think the bigger of a role that David Johnson gets next year, the better Carson Palmer is because of it. And he's still in that Arian system that airs it out. Palmer had the top ADOT out of every quarterback last year. High efficiency, 3 really good wide receivers. Yeah, I'm definitely excited about it too. I just don't know if I'd have him over Breeze.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that you've got going with Breeze is that you have a literal decade of consistency to tell you he probably is who we think he is, whereas Palmer has nothing close to that record. He has a really, really good year, like you were saying, pre-injury, but he's been really up and down with some really bad down in previous years.
Yeah, we were trying to figure out with his 2013, his first year with Bruce Arians, why he was so mediocre.
Yeah, and I don't have an answer for that. I thought that was a good question you posed that I still haven't solved or even attempted, I guess.
Yeah, me neither.
The only thing I don't quote me on this, but I think their offensive line might have been really bad. But that was the only thing that I could think of the other day when I was trying. But I'm not 100% sure. I think for Palmer, for me though, it's more of like the upside. I mean, Breeze and him both obviously have the QB1 upside. I think pretty much all the QBs in that top 9-ish range do. But I just feel like that offense gives a quarterback the QB1 upside a little more so than the kind of uncertainty that we have in New Orleans. I don't have any uncertainty in Breeze. I just more or less have uncertainty in the pieces
Does
around
the
him.
defense worry you though? Because that's an elite defense. I don't expect them to be playing from behind nearly as much as the Saints.
No, but I don't think Arians ever takes the foot off the gas like other coaches. He just keeps going. I mean, they had Palmer threw the ball like 19 times once, and I think he had last year, and I think he had 3 touchdowns and 300 yards. I mean, it's just.
Is that the game he came out at half?
He might have. Yeah, I don't think he played the whole game. I mean, they just don't care, man. They'll just throw the ball.
So, Josh, you have Cam Newton as your QB3 right now. Me and Johnny have him as our QB1. I had tweeted out earlier today that even if you include regression into your projections for Cam, he's still far and away fantastic. In standard leagues, again, not MFL10s, you take away 13 passing touchdowns from him, he's still the overall QB1. If you take 7 passing touchdowns away from him, he would have tied Luck's 2014 in total points. But again, this isn't MFL 10s. If you look at MFL 10s, where you remove week 17, he only would have outscored Brady by 1 rushing touchdown.
Yeah, I thought your stats were good, and the regression is built in. My counterpoints, which is basically anecdotal stats, it's not proving a case, but just looking at top 12 weeks, which doesn't take into account how good those top 12 weeks were, but Cam Newton over the last 2 years has had 14 top 12 weeks in 2 seasons. Andrew Luck had 13 in 1 season 2 years ago. That's a comparison. The 14 that Cam Newton has had over the last 2 years combined is the exact same number Jake Cutler has had in those 2 years combined. And so Cam Newton is kind of a boom or bust MFL 10 player, or has been for the last 2 years, where he has these ridiculous highs. And so it kind of depends what you're chasing. I like with Rodgers, and I am expecting with Luck. I could be very wrong, but my expectation is both of them are going to be very consistent. They're going to be up at the top 12, or at least very close to it, almost every week. And they may not have quite the heights of the 35, 40-point games that Cam might, but they're going to be more reliable than he is. And so it kind of depends on what you're shooting for, is my theory there.
So I think that's a great point. But again, it's best ball, so you want those highs. In MFL 10s and standard leagues, Cam Newton was a top 5 fantasy quarterback in 50% of his weeks. That's insane. I could pair that with Alex Smith, get a floor, and then also have that uber high ceiling. I think that's killer. On top of that, you mentioned the past 2 seasons. I think 2014 is kind of a bad year to go off of, just because he had that ankle injury, and then he also had the car accident. So I think that's why Kelvin Benjamin had all those targets. But you saw that decrease over the final 4 weeks of the season, and you saw the rushing attempts skyrocket. And then over the final 4 weeks of 2014, he was the number 1 quarterback. So I think 2014 is kind of I want to push it aside as an outlier year, where it was due to injury more than anything. It sapped his mobility. I don't know. I'm just kind of all in on Cam right now. Johnny, what do you think?
That's a fair point, but I mean, Carl has raised this, if you follow Carl on Twitter.
Carl Sapchik?
Yeah, a lot, is that...
Just go by a first name. He's well known.
Carl with a K. That he, I mean, and it's an interesting point, is that Kelvin Benjamin hurt that offense by being as inefficient as he was, and he wasn't really a field stretcher. He was kind of this... quasi tight end, wide receiver, whatever you want to call him, sort of bumbling. I don't know what he was, but he was heavily targeted, and he didn't do a whole lot with it. And once you removed him from the offense, it seemed like the passing game was a lot better. Cam's rushing aside, that was kind of sapped in 14 by the injury, but I mean, as a passer, he was better, throwing to guys who were sort of getting open downfield versus peppering this inefficient, tall target with passes. So is that going to hurt him this year by having Kelvin Benjamin back?
I just think, why would you Well, first of all, I think the reason he had so many targets was again due to that injury, where he didn't have his typical mobility. But yeah, even if that's not the case, why would you go from an offense that was okay in 2014, throwing 130 targets to Calvin Benjamin, to one that was fantastic last year, or arguably one of the best in the league without throwing him a single ball? I think definitely the 2016 offense is and should look way more like 2015 than 2014.
So you talked about regression with passing. One of the concerns I have is the rushing regression.
Mm-hmm.
And you can, whether it's correct or not, you can look at 2015 as an outlier for the pattern we'd seen with his rushing. Both overall, his yardage and his totals had been on decline since his rookie year. Basically, nearly every year, it's been a decline. But significantly for me, his rush attempts and rush touchdowns inside the 10-yard line had been dramatically dipping each of the 4 years. So he had 23 rush attempts inside the opponent's 10-yard line his rookie season, and it kept going down 21, 13, 11, and then he jumped back up to 19. They were running him inside the red zone more, maybe because they didn't have a Kelvin Benjamin. They didn't have enough targets in the red zone. And I'm worried that with rushing regression, I mean, from 2014 to 2015, he doubled his rushing touchdowns. And so going from 5 to 10, that's a significant jump in points right there. And so and on top of that, the passing, so his passing got better in the sense that there was 50 more passes, there was more yardage, he doubled his passing touchdowns. What really is significant is that his touchdown percentage was just insane as far as the jump he saw last year. And so if he has some regression in his efficiency, his touchdown efficiency, and he has less rushing production in terms of touchdowns, I think you stand to see regression in two fields, which could hurt him even more than you're projecting, just saying if he stepped back some in his passing.
Honestly, I think if you project that into it, it still doesn't really make too much of a dent. Because maybe I shouldn't be including the rookie season, but if you include the rookie season, his average rushing touchdowns per season is 8.25. He had 10 last year, so removes 12 points, and he's still clearing away the favorite if you include a 17-week season. He averaged 650 rushing yards per season. He had 636 last year. I think with regression, yeah, sure, he's due for regression as all top every year's QB1 is due for. I think still, even if you include that in terms of rushing points, it's 18 points, and then passing regression, another 30 points, but he was still 50 points above, 55 points above Russell Wilson in typical standard leagues. Maybe in the MFL10s it makes a little bit more of a difference with the 1 point per 20 passing yards, but I don't know. I still just I still love him.
Well, and I could very well be wrong. I was so wrong about him last year. I predicted that QB5 was kind of his ceiling last year, so I should not be making any Cam Newton claims this year. The best article I ever wrote was an arbitrage play article for PFF, where I said Matt Ryan's ADP should be swapped with Cam Newton's, and Jordan Cameron's should be swapped with Jordan Reed's. I'll never get that lucky again. That's fire.
That's pretty awesome, dude. No, the other thing is they didn't add a real running back threat to Jonathan Stewart, and Jonathan Stewart didn't really seem to be a big threat to Cam's goal line touches.
Yeah, no D-Will. That's a good point.
Right. So it doesn't seem like there's a second running back that he's going to be losing those goal line carries to, and they seem pretty content to kind of split them up between him and Stewart.
So my question is this: does this end up mattering to you guys? Are you taking the QB1 on the board ever?
Rarely.
Yeah. So I'll disagree. I tweeted out a picture earlier today at Dude Fantasy Bro. That's my handle. On average, each of the top 12 QBs are being drafted over a round later than last year. Just by MFL10 average draft position, I took the ADP we have today, and I compared it to an ADP list I pulled in May or June of last year. Like that's super significant. This is like what like JJ Zachariason should be like so happy with himself. What a like QB ADP is like demolished compared to like years prior. But also, if you look at just the QB1 this year, the overall QB1, he's being drafted 16 picks later than last year, and the QB2 is 28 picks later. So I'm just like, I think that's an immense value. Like when last year I had to pay a 4th-round pick for Aaron Rodgers, and this year I can get him in the 7th, 6th, late 6th, whatever. Yeah, I'm taking that. I'm definitely grabbing the QB1, I'm grabbing the QB2, I'm grabbing the QB3, 4, 5. Last year I really went late round QB. This year I'm grabbing that value. I know, Josh, you said earlier today that you think the sweet spot is kind of like the QB 10 to 15 range. Is that right?
Yeah.
Who are you targeting there?
Like I said earlier, I have a ton of Rivers and Dalton, and Eli as well. I think that trio is ones that I see that have a lot of upside. That I consider them pretty reliable. Although, like we said, Dalton may have some questions there, but that matches up with what you found. That also is a sweet spot in terms of a fall in ADP. Is that all of those are double-digit falls, like QB 10 to QB 15, are going much later than they were. Coming back to your point about QB1 and QB2, it sounds like an argument for waiting for the QB1 to go off the board and then waiting a long time for QB2. Your data showing that the second quarterback is about 17 picks later than the first, and it's a fall of 28 as compared to last year. That's why I brought it up. Is I'm going earlier QB as well. I agree with that. I'm taking a lot better quarterbacks than I have the last 2 years. But I'm not taking the first one. It seems like there's a first one that goes, usually Cam, and then I can wait 2 rounds and get my pick of that same tier.
You're right. I have like Russell and Aaron like pretty close to Cam. I mean, still a round drop off from last year is a value. Sometimes I'll take it if I don't see anyone else I like. But yeah, maybe the bigger value is the second guy, or even Breeze if we have him super close to our top 4.
I think Russell's the value right now.
Yeah.
For the top 4.
What gives with his splits in the two halves of the season? Does that worry you at all? How slow they started?
I think it doesn't worry me because we saw that they just drafted a pass-catching running back really early in the NFL draft. And I think it kind of shows that they didn't really have that last year. They had Fred Jackson, and he was like okay, and he had that brutal fumble, and it seemed like they were just like really, really upset with that. And so I think it kind of shows a shift in the offensive mindset of the team, where they want to give him a few more passing weapons. They brought back Curse. And they drafted Tyler Lockett last year, and they kind of let the reins off on Doug Baldwin towards the end of the season as well. They traded for Jimmy Graham last year. It didn't really work out, but I think they've made moves to kind of give him more opportunity to do the things that he was doing in the second half of the season last year.
I love Russ. I think arguably after Cam, he was the second best quarterback in the league, maybe Palmer, but insane efficiency. He led in PFF's QB rating. But really, that's what worried me. It seemed like a perfect storm in order to let him loose. He needed Jimmy Graham to go down with an injury. He needed Lynch to go down with an injury, and then he just let it fly. I really desperately want them to just be like, okay, yeah, it's a passing league. Have that at Russ. But I'm also super worried they just give Rawls and Procise and co 30 carries a game. There is a fear there, but I definitely lean more towards he's going to have another top 5 season fairly easily. I kind of want to talk about Jordy. So back to my Cam love, he lost his apparently arguably best wide receiver, and he was still the QB1. Aaron Rodgers, meanwhile, lost his best wide receiver and kind of fell off a little bit. Basically, if you look at his 7 seasons prior and you take the averages of that on a 16-game pace, he was 570 yards short, 4 passing touchdowns shy, 2 rushing touchdowns, and 2.75 fantasy points per game off of that average. I mean, I love Rodgers. He's been a monster when he's healthy. Does that worry you at all? A 30-plus-year-old wide receiver coming back from the ACL. Rodgers was good, but he struggled for Aaron Rodgers. What do you think, Josh?
I think that the Jordy worries, there's something to that. Coming off an ACL isn't easy, but then at his age as well, that has got to make the recovery a little slower and less sure. I'm not worried about Rodgers himself. I think that he is incredible. I think that he's incredibly efficient, and I think he was just playing with garbage in a garbage situation last year. Devontae Adams is trash. Jeff Janis isn't a professional player.
Yes.
He had nothing there. So,
yeah.
And he didn't play well. I mean, he didn't elevate the team. He certainly was having his own issues, but I don't have the concern that he is a worse player than we thought he was. I think it just was a snowball effect around him, and he just kind of fed into it. But all that said, what did he end up, QB7? It's not as if he became a trash quarterback. He's not Matt Ryan. And so I think that he could have a ridiculous, like, Brady to Randy Moss-esque season if Jordy comes back healthy and they are clicking. And I think he wants to prove he is not who he was last year, Aaron Rodgers. But I do think you're right that there's some reason to be concerned. What if Jordy doesn't come back as real Jordy, and they're looking at essentially the same weapons plus Jared Cook this year?
Yeah, I think that's a bunch of great points. And the added Jared Cook, who has a ton of drops every single year. I still feel comfortable with Aaron in my top 4, definitely. So you brought up Matt Ryan, and you kind of trashed him a little bit. And it's funny because Matt Ryan and Matt Stafford are 2 guys that I've kind of given you a little bit of grief for this offseason. You're very high on both of them, at least compared to ADP. You want to state your case for either of them?
I mean, I think that's kind of a misstatement, if I can correct you. I've got them at 19 and 20, and their ADP is 18 and 19.
Okay.
So I am not high on them. Many of my mentions, when I tweeted you these rankings, I wasn't trying to publicize them. I'm not trying to catch heat, but whatever, you retweet it and I catch the heat. So most of the mentions were that Matthew Stafford is too low at QB 20.
Really?
And many of them. I mean, half dozen to a dozen different people saying Stafford should be higher. He's going to be amazing. Jim Bob Cooter is like the next Lombardi. I mean, people love that guy. We don't know anything about him. He just had 8 good weeks. And it certainly looks good. The coincidental timing, I mean, maybe it's not coincidence. Maybe it is legitimate. I'm not doubting that. I'm mocking it. But the point is, I do have serious concerns that Stafford has never been good, but he's had an elite weapon to save him in bad situations. And he doesn't have that now. He still has – it is helpful to be throwing shorter, but I'm not convinced that he has nearly the upside that some people think. So that's on Stafford. For Ryan, I have written positive things about Ryan for 2 QBs, and I like him. And what I've said is I like him because he's been miscast as a QB1 the last couple of years. He was a QB1 for a little while when we didn't have great passers in the league, but he really hasn't been that guy the last couple of years, but he's been drafted as such. I like him this year because he's being priced as who he is. That he's kind of a reliable QB2. He'll have some good weeks, but he's nothing that exciting. And so he's another one in that mold, kind of like I mentioned with Jameis, that he's going to be starting. He's going to be having fine weeks. I'm not scared to put him in the lineup in a normal redraft league, but I also would not be excited. I am not high on him. I'm just higher than you are this year.
Yeah, I think the one thing for Matt Ryan that I've always really disliked, and in Matt Ryan week on DFS last year, if anyone followed me, they knew that I didn't even play Matt Ryan when he played against the Saints last year. I just don't think Matt Ryan has like upside. He seems to be a guy who he's almost like Alex Smith like, where he has that 250 yards, 1 touchdown, 2 touchdowns type thing, but he never really has those 400-yard, 3 or 4 touchdown games that people sort of think that he has or that he has had in the past. He had a few of those kind of games when he had, Julio, Roddy White, and Tony Gonzalez all on the roster, but without those guys on the team, he really doesn't have that ceiling that a lot of people think that he has, and he's really more of a floor quarterback, and that's kind of why I'm not really. I think in a 2-quarterback league, I think I would love to have Matt Ryan as my second quarterback for stability, but I think in MFL10s, where I'm kind of looking for some explosive weeks, I'm probably not really touching Matt Ryan. I think I picked up my first share of him in like the 14th round the other day. And that might be, I may only have a few of him because I just don't think he has that top 12 upside. And from your chart, it looks like he had 0 top 12 weeks last year, just to kind of emphasize his sort of floor versus ceiling ability.
He had 3, but still, it was not very exciting.
Oh yeah, he did have 3.
But yeah, to your point, I'll credit Mike Beers for looking at the top 12 stats over a longer time frame than I have, and so my article over at 2QBs has his charts all through it for Matt Ryan. And just to your point about ceiling, over the course of the last 4 seasons, Ryan only had 3 35-point games and only 2 more 30-point games. He's only been a QB1 over those 4 seasons in 40% of his games. And so he's not even hitting QB1 numbers half the time, but then he also doesn't have a lot of upside, like you said, even in his QB1 weeks.
Yeah, a huge shout-out to @BeersWaters. His charts were the ones I cited in my Cam over Ryan article last year. With regards to Ryan this year, if I were to play devil's advocate, the thing with him is over the last 5 seasons, he was QB7, QB11, QB7, QB8, QB9, and then whatever he was last year for the first time not finishing as a QB1. So that's like super impressive. An issue I have with him is with him and Eli, I'm like, please get a really good wide receiver too. In my opinion, Eli got that with Shep. With the Falcons, I don't think Sanu is good. I don't think he really helps them. And Ryan, to me, just looked lost last year in Shanahan's system. Maybe a second year in that system makes him a little better, but it's just not something I'm too optimistic about, to be honest.
The one thing I'll just note that I haven't really worked through myself is that his last season, in terms of attempts and yards, is nearly identical to the 3 seasons before that. They're statistically basically the same. It's the touchdowns that were significantly lower. And so I haven't gone through and looked at it closely to see weekly, obviously, like we said, the ceiling wasn't there last year. It was more spaced out. But it was interesting to me that attempts and yardage stayed roughly the same. It's just he wasn't throwing passing touchdowns.
That's actually a really good point, and he did lead the league in red zone turnovers last year.
Yeah, I was just going to say that leading up to the week before Ryan was going to play the Saints and kind of everyone had predetermined that he would be the QB1 that week, I went back and watched all of his red zone attempts, and he was pretty much awful in the red zone. He was essentially 100% relying on Julio. If Julio wasn't open, he had no idea what he was doing with the ball. So I don't know if Sanu is going to help that. They didn't really add a second option for him to rely on in the red zone. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure if a second year in with Shanahan will kind of correct those mistakes, but he definitely struggled with his reads in the red zone last year. You guys want to talk Stafford?
I love me some Jim Bob Cooter. The super interesting thing about that was just how his A-dot just completely decreased. Pat Thorman wrote a great article on it. It was just like very like he was so productive given that incredibly small ADOT. Just didn't look like it was something that was sustainable. I mean, he was much better after that, but I mean, he's still missing Calvin Johnson, and you know how he's been throughout his career in games that Calvin Johnson missed or was a decoy. He's just not someone I'm excited about.
Wasn't Calvin a decoy all last season, though?
Oh.
I mean, I think that was one thing that Jim Bob Cooter kind of came in and realized was that Calvin couldn't really run deep anymore. I mean, he didn't really have that ability that he used to have, so he was having sort of the team running some shorter stuff, and you could tell it boosted Calvin's production. Calvin was really starting to struggle there, running 9 routes down the field. So Calvin wasn't necessarily Calvin. So, you know, Stafford throwing to 70-80% of what Calvin used to be, he was still okay in that system. The question is whether or not Marvin Jones and Eric Ebron can kind of pick up that slack. I mean, we know what Tate is, and Tate is a good player, and he's going to continue to do what he was doing. But it's whether or not the other guys are going to be able to pick up that slack that Calvin left there.
I mean, they certainly won't be Calvin in terms of the defensive coverage that they pull. And even though in hindsight we know that Calvin wasn't a true decoy, I mean, it's tongue-in-cheek, but he was much more a decoy than he normally was. I don't think that the NFL defenses knew that nearly to the same degree while they're game planning and while they're deciding what to do with coverages. And so even if they did by the end of the season, more so each week, I still think it's very different than coming into this season where they're saying, well, we don't have to shade that side of the field. I mean, maybe they will with Tate, but it's not the same effect you have with a Calvin Johnson on the field. And I say that to say I don't know what to expect that to look like. The ADOT went down, but then the touchdowns went way up and interceptions went down. The whole offense just seemed to be more successful, longer drives. They had more points scored per game, per drive. I mean, the whole offense changed. And so I don't think it was just that Stafford got better. Maybe the whole offense seems to be clicking in this way of functioning, this system. But I really don't know. I also am not thrilled with Stafford. I'm not looking forward to drafting him at any point.
All right, so who are you trying to go out of your way to draft? You're in an MFL10. You're like, okay, here are the wide receivers I'm going after, the running backs I'm going after, and then if my guy is there, I'm grabbing him. Is that Phillip Rivers for you? Who is that?
It was Phillip Rivers until recently. Evan Silva bumped him up to a price where I'm not chasing anymore. Because now to chase, I have to get into single-digit rounds because he could reasonably be going in the 10th round now, and I'm not chasing him into the 8th, 9th round, which is where I would have to chase. I have Rivers all over the place, but my average pick is 130, so I was chasing in the 11th round, and that's a very different sort of thing. Now I'm starting to look a lot more at Kirk Cousins. I kind of talked myself into drinking the Kool-Aid, which is just so dangerous. I'm a lifelong Redskins fan, and the pessimism just knows this whole thing is collapsing because that's all we've done for 2 decades. But I think I'm starting to talk myself into it. I mean, before last season, when RG3 was still the starter, I wrote that Kirk Cousins could be legitimately I said he could be top 5 potentially if he came in and played, because you look at Jay Gruden and what he did with Andy Dalton, who isn't some special talent. And we looked at the numbers between the Redskins and the Bengals offense. They look roughly the same. He's throwing at the same volume, same efficiency with different quarterbacks. And I think that them keeping the same weapons, everyone's coming in healthy. They add Doxson, who may be another weapon in the red zone if they need another one. They certainly aren't going to be going more run heavy. They don't have the weapons to do that. I'm starting to talk myself into Cousins, particularly because he's still... I mean, look at his ADP right now is 141. You're not having to pay a huge price. You can still stack him with someone else you like better. But I do think the upside is there, that he's being priced as if it's sure that he's going to have a huge decline.
Yeah, I completely agree with you there. I think like Bortles and Cousins, for some reason, the fantasy experts are just hammering Like Bortles was the QB4 last year, and now and I was getting so much slack for having him as the QB14. Same thing with Cousins, who was like a really solid QB1, especially in best ball and DFS last year, and I have him QB15, and I'm getting hammered. I like him a lot. I think he's an amazing situation. I'm kind of like a Scott McLuhan truther. You have Jordan Reed, arguably one of the best pass-catching tight ends in the league. Deshaun Jackson, Pierre Garçon. They just drafted Doxson in the first. Their starting running back isn't very good, but is much better as a receiving back, as a rusher. Chris Thompson is only good as a receiving back. I think Scott McLuhan knows this, and I think despite Cousins' mediocrity, he expects this offense to be run entirely through him, and he set him up for a situation to be successful. And I think he's going to shock a lot of people this year. I think he's going to have a ton of volume. He's going to have the weapons surrounding him to be successful. I think he's going to put together a really solid fantasy season.
And we sort of don't care about turnovers in fantasy football to some degree. So a guy like Cousins, who's definitely going to make his mistakes, is sort of doesn't really matter.
My cousin's anecdote that has nothing to do with fantasy, but I'll just share it, is driving home, having to listen to the game on the audio. So I try and catch all the games. I'm a fan. I try and keep it away from my analysis, but I'm definitely a fan. So I'm stuck in the car listening on the radio the game that at the end of the first half they're in the red zone with the time running, and instead of spiking the ball, he kneels with no timeouts, and the half ends.
But then he tried to spike it after he kneeled, though.
After kneeling, yeah, you might as well. But yeah, I just picture this whole season going that way in my worst nightmares.
It's possible.
I like Cousins especially because I'm a Giants fan, and prior to this season, he averaged like 4 turnovers per game against the Giants. Johnny, who's the guy you're targeting?
Andy Dalton is one, but I think he's kind of played out because we're all sort of targeting that guy. I think in the later rounds, the guy I'm sort of having more exposure to, I think, than a lot of people, is Joe Flacco. I think he was really good.
Do you say that as a Ravens fan? A homer?
No, dude. Trust me, it is not as a homer. Funny that we're both recommending like our favorite team quarterbacks, but no, I mean, like, as a homer, I should be like even less likely to recommend Joe Flacco. But I think he was really good with Trestman. I believe, if I remember right, he won 2 Millionaire Maker finishes, and he had this bigger ceiling last year than people kind of gave him credit for. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I know that he was putting together one of his better years with the Trestman system, with an aging Steve Smith. Perryman wasn't on the field. His next best wide receiver was Kamar Aiken. His tight end was Crockett Gilmore. I mean, they didn't really have all these options, and now they're going to have a better running back situations in theory with Kenneth Dixon and Buck Allen as their sort of their receiving back. And I think that if he was to continue the pace that he was putting together last year, then he is probably going to crush his ADP, unless he sort of falls off that pace that he was on last year.
All right, so looking at it right now, if you exclude the game where he left injured, and you round up for each of these, he scored at least 24 points in half of his games. That's like really good.
He was a top 12 in probably that exact same half, but yeah, half his games.
Wow. All right, so my guy is the same exact guy I had last year for pretty much the same exact reason. Like I said, the way I've been kind of targeting MFL10s is I'll take one of those top 5 or 6 guys, and then I'll just grab some like kind of scrub guy who can give me like a solid floor. And my guy this year is the same guy as last year. My most owned quarterback last year, one of my most owned quarterbacks this year, is Alex Smith. Yeah, I don't think he really has a ceiling, but again, if I'm already getting that ceiling in the first 7 or 8 rounds, that's okay. Last year, he was the QB 15 in MFL10s. By ADP this year right now, he's QB 24. That's just a profit I'm going to take every single time if I can.
He actually also started to show a little bit of a ceiling in the second half of last season. He put together a few big games, big for Alex Smith terms, in the second half of last season compared to what we saw in previous years.
Yeah. He had 3 games over 26 points.
He had 1 game over 300 passing yards.
Yeah, but he was running the ball.
Yeah, he's. I mean, every year he's been a good rusher, so
Yeah.
it's not as if it's a fluke thing. So he's going to get his rush attempts.
All right, maybe we'll end on this. Is there? I don't have anything planned, so I have no idea. But is there any quarterback that you like especially hate that you're completely staying away from? Not necessarily based on ADP, just like in general, like a top drafted quarterback you just like hate or don't like this season.
I'll say that I'm not drinking the Ryan Tannehill Kool-Aid.
Yes.
I sort of I like Ryan Tannehill, but I think the love that he's getting, it has him like well out of the range where I'm taking him. I'm taking Andy Dalton, Kirk Cousins over him, sort of in a. I believe they're in a. They're like 10 picks before him. Taking them over him pretty much every time. I'd rather wait, 20 more picks and take Joe Flacco than reach on Ryan Tannehill. So he's a guy that I'm probably pretty much not going to have on my rosters. Maybe 1 or 2 shares.
What about you, Josh?
I mean, one that I will say I hate is Blake Bortles, just because of the love for him is just insane to me.
Wait, there's love. I thought everyone hates him.
No way. He's what, QB 8 right now, which is a dip from where he was. I mean, he's being taken in the 9th round right now.
That's fair.
Like, it's just insane, the ADP he got boosted to. I mean, you look at him, Cousins, and Tyrod all kind of came out of nowhere, and I see them as roughly the same. Like, we don't know. They had 1 year. We'll see what happens. And yet he's being drafted as QB8. Like, that's just mind-blowing to me that we're that sure, because Allen Robinson is amazing, that Blake Bortles has to be amazing as well. But really my answer, like, I'll take Bortles if he falls to the right spot. Really the one that I don't know that I'll own almost at all is Derek Carr.
Yeah.
I mean, he's going as QB 13. I don't mind him, but I also think he's just going to be a short, boring, bland. I mean, he is that Alex Smith type, where I don't think he's going to have that many good weeks, and if he was priced like Alex Smith, I'd have no issue with him. But when you're taking him, like, at ADP, Mariota's going after him, Cousins, Romo, Dalton, Tyrod. There's so many options I would rather have for the upside over Carr, and so I don't see scenarios in drafts where I'm thinking, yeah, this is a good place to take him.
Yeah, you just kind of stole mine with Carr. Also, Jameis, who we talked on earlier, at his ridiculous ADP. I meant to end the podcast right now, but I kind of want to be a little like selfish and pick your brain, Josh. My most owned pre-NFL draft quarterback was Tony Romo. I was all in on him. I'm like, oh, yeah, like efficiency, like he's a lock for a QB1 season. And then they drafted Zeke Elliott, and now I'm kind of nervous that the volume definitely won't be there, and he needs to just be super efficient in order to return at his fantasy points at a profit for me. I don't know. What do you think? I've kind of cooled down on him post draft.
I don't think that he's really been a volume guy for most of his career. I mean, he had 1 season. I'm looking at it now. 2012, he had 650 attempts, if I'm rounding. And other than that, he's never been over 550. He is just right around the 4,000-yard mark most of the time. He's still been good, but he just hasn't been a volume guy most of his career. I'm not as worried about Zeke reducing his volume as some people are. I am so much not a running back expert, but I'm skeptical that a rookie running back is going to come in and become the RB1 or RB3 or wherever people are taking him and just steal these hundreds and hundreds of carries and change the whole offense, and just that the whole Cowboys team changes because of this pick. He'll be good. He'll be very reliable. I expect all that, but I don't see it as this sea change that Romo is all of a sudden a different player than we could have expected before the pick. And I mean, one of the biggest pluses for Elliott, if I understand correctly, is his ability to play in the passing game, both blocking and receiving. And so I'm not convinced that it changes the offense in the way that some people might believe.
Yeah, I think that's awesome. I think you put to bed my concerns. John, are there any final questions you want to ask Josh?
I don't think so. Not for tonight.
All right, Josh, man, you were an awesome guest. Thank you so much for being our first ever iTunes guest. You did a killer job. Any final words, anyone, before I exit out?
No, just thank you guys. I really appreciate coming on, and glad to be the first one to hit iTunes.
Thank you, Josh.
Awesome. And if you want to find Josh on Twitter, he's at Lake2 TWO QBs. Scott is at Dude Fantasy Bro. I am at SuperDuperman22.
Could that be longer?
It's hard to fit in 140 characters. And if you want to check out Josh's work, find him on RotoViz and the stuff that he's doing with 2QBs at 2QBs. Thanks for listening, guys.